This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. I won't mention the name of the base, but I'm sure that there are many people out there who will know which one it is once I make mention of some of the details to this story. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived to this base in 2006, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that that little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working, but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the shit out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turned off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now, skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I had been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas, which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Alpha, aka partner, had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, a cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check, seeing as all the maintenance guys had went home for the night in this area. The only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We pile in, lock the gates behind us, and continue on our way. My Alpha was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. My Alpha makes the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting the shit, when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible. As we approached the structure from my previous story, and I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear, but as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite of the structure, and out of my left ear, I hear a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan begins to ring inside the cab of the truck between the 2 of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I feel my blood turn cold, and I quickly turn to my Alpha and yell, "Dude, cut that shit out." My Alpha turns to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he begins to take his foot off the accelerator and asks, "Am I going too fast?" I remain silent for a moment, with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listen. I hear the noise again. My partner interrupts and asks, "What's wrong?" I quickly turn the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whisper to him, "Do you hear that?" He stops the truck in confusion and listens closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both hear it this time. That long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again. but he quickly interrupts and says with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What the f*** is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck are easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine has that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time. That groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, my Alpha puts the truck in drive, and he hauls our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street in that entire base. He nearly flips the truck going around a curve, but it doesn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the 2 gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. My Alpha watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of shit, or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift, and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to the both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place, and the other in that building behind you, as he points at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliche with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark.